Well, welcome everyone to week 5 of the Elevate AEC experience. We have a big day with our headline keynote speaker today, Phil Bernstein, followed by our Elevate Her symposium. But before we get started, I want to share a brief message from our platinum sponsor, Corporate Tax Advisors. They help AEC firms earn tax credits earmarked for design firms. Here's Dawson Fairco to share some more about what they do.
Having been a consultant, a specialized consultant in this area of the federal code called the Federal Research and Design Tax Credit, I've noticed through the years that a lot of the relationship between the specialized vendor and the client has changed. The reason we incepted, the reason we founded Corporate Tax Advisors is because we saw the industry go from a very client-centric approach to a very fee-centric approach, from being very relational to being very transactional. We wanted to bring that back into the industry. We all have arrows, obstacles that are hitting us from all sides. We want to be a partner in the organization. We want to be a true business partnership. You know, being more relational, being more client-centric, less fee-centric. It was asked of me, what is the defining moment for you in your business? And as I thought about that, the defining moment, there's no doubt that we are exceptionally grateful for every client that we service in areas of tax specialty. The defining moment is when that feeling of gratefulness or that voice of gratefulness is reciprocated back from our client, that they're grateful for the services that we provide. When we hear that, we know we are doing exactly what we created Corporate Tax Advisors to be, a true partner in doing business together.
Dawson will be sharing his insight a week from Monday on November 9th at 11 a.m. Central. If you're not familiar with what they do, you really do need to tune into their session and learn more. Most of the firms in this virtual room can benefit from this incentive, and the rewards go straight to your bottom line, giving you more dollars to invest in your people and growth. I'm actually working with several firms right now who have recently completed the process with CTA, and they're blown away with the results, wondering why they didn't do this sooner. So thank you, Dawson, and CTA for being our platinum sponsor. And now I'm delighted to introduce Phil Bernstein, our headline keynote speaker for today. Phil is an architect and professor adjunct in professional practice at the Yale School of Architecture, where he has taught since 1988. He was formerly a vice president at Autodesk, where he was responsible for setting the company's future vision and strategy for technology, as well as cultivating and sustaining the firm's relationships with strategic industry. Phil was the executive responsible for Autodesk Waltham AEC headquarters project, which received more than 14 architectural awards, including those from the American Institute of Architects, Business Week Architectural Record, the Association of General Contractors, and Interiors Magazine. Phil received a Bachelor of Arts magna cum laude with distinction in architecture from Yale University and a Master of Architecture also from Yale. He is a senior fellow of the Design Futures Council, a fellow of the American Institute of Architects, and former chair of the AIA National Contract Documents Committee. Delighted to welcome Phil to the virtual stage to discuss opportunities in a post-pandemic market.
Thank you, Chad. Appreciate the opportunity from Zweig to talk to folks today a little bit about some of my thoughts about what's happening in the profession and where things are kind of generally going. Let's put this thing into, that look good? Olivia, that look okay? We're ready to go?
Great.
Great. So my assignment today, I was really kind of thrilled to get from our colleagues here, because the question that we're going to be looking at is 3 issues as they relate to primarily to the design professions and their relationship to the rest of the AEC industry in 3 frames of reference. Pedagogy, in other words, what's happening with how we train the next generation of AEC professionals. Practice, what's happening within those firms, and then ultimately what's happening in the broader professions of AEC. And I'm going to stipulate for purposes of today's discussion that as an architect, as someone who practiced architecture for a long time and who teaches architects, my lens is peculiar to that profession. But I think a lot of the ideas that I'm going to be talking about today, I hope, are more broadly applicable to what's happening. So in February of last year, February of this year, one of my jobs at Yale is to talk to our students about their career possibilities. And it was early February, and we gathered the school and we talked about how good the economy was and how everything was going great, and there was so much work, and there hadn't been a recession for a while, there were no signs that anything terrible was really coming. I said to my students, well, you're probably going to see a recession in your career, but right now there are no economic indicators that was the case. And of course, 30 days later, that entire line of reasoning turned out to be completely wrong. And it's kind of jolted both the pandemic has jolted the profession and a profession of architecture, design professions in general, and I think the building industry in particular. And so one of the themes of what we'll talk about today is, how does this particular moment, existential moment, give us a chance in the building industry to rethink some of the aspects of how we do our business and come out of the back end of this thing in a way that's interesting. Now, I'm just going to stipulate at the beginning this argument that I'm sure all of you are familiar with. The building industry isn't active compared to the rest of the economy, blah, blah, blah. Let's just say everybody understands that argument. It's been made for 2 decades now. We'll agree with it and stipulate it's the case. But what is also the case, which provides us with one lens through which we can look at this problem, is that the building industry also is desperately under-supported by modern tools like digital technology. These 2 charts on the right, which are from McKinsey, plot various kinds of industries relative to their productivity growth on the y-axis and their degrees of digitization on the x-axis. So you see, for example, in the US is on top and Europe is on the bottom, the information communication technology sector, high degree of digitization, very high degree of year-over-year productivity growth during the 14 years. Construction is in the lower left-hand quadrant. And so one of the catalyzing influences that might bring us to a different kind of discussion is technology. And in my previous job, working for a tech company, I might have argued it was the most important thing, but I'm going to try to broaden the argument in a different kind of way. And one of the ways that we have to do that, I think, is to look deeply at what the fundamental responsibilities are of those of us who are in the building industry. And one of the things that I talk about a lot with my students, and I need to remind them on a regular basis, is the reason that design and construction professionals exist as professionals is a very important social reason, which is to protect the public's health, safety, and welfare. And that obligation really operates at the highest level of what our enterprise is in the building industry. And we're at a very particular moment, historical moment, where that obligation has never been more critical. And at the same time, the social awareness amongst both our clients and the public and our students, I think, has never been as heightened as it has been now. And, there are kind of a bunch of issues that are out there that, deserve to be thought about, whether it's problems that were created by the failures of the supply chain and certification, inspection, and installation that resulted in this fire in London, where the Grenfell Tower burned and killed over 80 people. And it's not a coincidence that fire occurred not in a wealthy multifamily tower in London, but in a public housing project. Like climate change and the relationship of the building industry's contribution of carbon to the change in the atmosphere is becoming more and more apparent. There are lots of discussions going on now about issues of social justice and racial equity, and we have to start questioning ourselves about the role of the built environment in instantiating some of that inequality, and what role architects, engineers, contractors play in creating the physical context in which those things happen. And then something that's become top of mind, particularly for those of us in education, is suddenly there's a strong correlation between public health questions and our skills as AEC professionals. And I suddenly found myself, as a full-time academic now, I thought I was going to get to spend the summer, writing a book and doing some research and taking a little bit of a respite. That turned out not to be the case, as we spent the entire summer operating as architects and with our consulting engineers and other consultants and our colleagues from the public health school here at Yale, the medical school here at Yale, the nursing school here at Yale, trying to figure out how we were going to actually open our building here. This is the Paul Rudolph building at Yale, where the School of Architecture is located. And we spent an enormous amount of time deploying our AEC skills in the service of figuring out how to run a building during a public health crisis, and doing detailed planning of occupancy, circulation, air quality, generating lengthy analyses that we use to present to the university administration to make we really couldn't teach architecture entirely remote in our physical spaces. And we had a plan for how to make that happen, going through our building and analyzing every possible constriction that might create a potential public health hazard, analyzing all of the systems of the building through a lens that we had never really considered before. How through this building, what happens during a fire, how do we have to re-sign the building in terms of its graphics to make it sort of operating, and then studying the building in an extreme detail to figure out how we could occupy it in order to meet our pedagogical goals, to allow people to be in a studio setting in this case, while not over-occupying the building, respecting the building's need to change its air. And we ended up doing an enormous amount of what I'd call meta-architectural work, trying to apply architectural planning principles on top of our existing building. You can see here, this is our detailed studio occupancy schedule, where the orange students are assigned to either orange blocks or blue blocks, and they have to be out of the building during certain times. And we have to bring folks into the studios to make sure that they're out of studio, because as you know, architects like to stay in studio. And we have this complex system where we tell people when you can be in the building and when you cannot. And studio occupancy is now designated where when you're in studio working, as you see this student here on the left, you got to be wearing a mask. You can't be eating, and your desk mate who's in a different studio. Once upon a time, your desk mate was in the same class as you. Now your desk mate is in a different studio, and she'll be there at a different time. And at the same time, kind of traditional pedagogical strategies for teaching architecture, which is gathering large groups of people together so they can share insights, have been completely sort of deconstructed and reconstructed. This is a classroom in our exhibition gallery. You can see me here teaching a class to 18 students in person. On the screen there is Billy Chen, who is one of our faculty members and is designing the Obama Library right now. And she's visiting our class in these large work tables designed for social distancing. And we cobbled this classroom together with a lot of leftover technology, multiple screens, cameras, microphones, masks. And it's, we're really having to rethink the basic infrastructure of how we go about teaching architecture. Then we decided that room wasn't working, so we reconfigured it into a different configuration, which it's a picture of me teaching a class yesterday, still maintaining social distancing, but again, having to constantly rethink the relationship between the delivery of insight and how students or clients receive it. And so there's been a lot of explorations of different kinds of technologies to try to maintain the quality and texture of an AEC education while doing it remotely. We can't have traditional reviews, so we're using tools like Miro to collect students' work and create a virtual room for making that happen. High degree of reliance on tools like Zoom, and being able to bring in intellectual resources from all around the world. So the bad news is that we can't fly a famous architect or engineer in to review student work. The good news is we spend money and a lot less carbon bringing these people. And we're really trying to deploy as much of these different kinds of technologies as we can to an experience that is as close to a traditional architectural experience as possible, but it's still not fabulous. So here's a seminar where half the students are in Zoom in our main seminar room, and the other half are sitting at a conference table, socially distanced, wearing masks, using laptops. Yeah, I can normally get 45 people in this room for a crowded faculty meeting. Now the way people interact with one another is different. And what I think what that means is this is not just a temporary stop in Zoom land. I think what we're doing, what we're seeing here is we're going to be training a generation of young architects, engineers, and builders who are wired differently and can interact with one another differently. They realize that physical presence, while important, is not necessary, and talent now can be delivered pretty much any place around the world. A number of my students who graduated last year have been hired by firms who've never physically seen them. They've only seen them virtually. They interviewed, they were hired, and they now work remotely. So the texture of the talent pool is actually going to be different. And the interests in issues that are starting to bubble up in the training and in the psyche of the building industry are starting to change. This is a course that I'm teaching this semester with my colleague Lou DeBacher from the law school called Fighting Slavery in the Building Supply Chain. Lou was the ambassador in the Obama administration who worked on forced labor issues. And it turns out there's a significant amount of forced labor and enslaved labor in the building industry across the entire supply chain. And what we're looking at this semester is what is, in particular, the architect's relationship to the supply chain. And that kind of thinking about looking at the relationship of the various players in the building industry to their supply chain is part of the change in the perspective that will change pedagogy practice and the profession. My spring course is a course called Exploring New Value for Design Practice. And what this course does is exploit our students' lack of interest in traditional business models. You know, architecture, engineering, construction students are just as much caught up in startup culture and innovation and disruption as anyone else. And so in this course, what we do is we look at business models of architectural practice, and we try to figure out ways to disrupt them. And I set out for them a final project that says, if you have to design a business and write a business plan for anything that you think architects can do. But the rule is you cannot be paid lump sum fees for what you do. You have to convert your value proposition in different ways. And what I've seen over the 5 or 6 years I've been teaching this course is an emergent set of typologies around the different strategies that the students take, whether it's verticalizing an architect in some other way, or connecting two players in the process, owner, architect, and contractor, or creating some kind of supporting service. And if you're interested in this topic in more detail, I wrote an article in Architectural Design last November called The Distractions of Disruptions that describes it in a little bit more detail. Now, a central part of our pedagogy at the School of Architecture is something called the Building Project, which is a design build project it's relatively common to see this in architectural curricula now, but we started this 55 years ago. So we have a long tradition of having our first year graduate students spend the spring semester designing a building for a client, detailing that building, and then spending the summer building it. But over this particular summer, we were not allowed by university regulations to let our students into the field to build things, because while construction was allowed in Connecticut, construction by students was not. So we had to reframe the entire building project this year. This year, the students were building a 2-unit house for a homeless services organization here in New Haven. And we had to reframe the entire problem so our faculty and a few of our recent graduates could act as the construction crew. And our students spent time that they would have spent doing construction, really thinking carefully about how to prefabricate, sequence, and deliver this project in a much more profound way than they would have in past semesters. In past semesters, they would have done a set of light working drawings, and part of the experience was to go out into the field and figure it out in the field. And now they are having to think much more deeply about what the relationship is between these pieces. At the same time, we're teaching a second course this semester, which is, I think, super interesting. It's a project we're doing for the Peabody Museum, which is our museum on campus of natural history that does a lot of field biology work. And my colleague, Alan Morgansky, who studies the circular carbon economy, is taking a group of our recent graduates. There was a seminar for students who were going to graduate last spring, and then those students, having graduated, could become construction workers. And they have designed a building for the Peabody Museum that's going to be built on one of the small islands off the coast of Connecticut that is a research and classroom building based on these principles of the circular carbon economy. So they were doing things like collecting abandoned CLT panels from the Bureau of Tobacco and Firearms, who builds these temporary CLT structures and then tries to burn them, or harvesting hardwood from the Yale Forestry School's forest, which is up north of here in Old Lyme, Connecticut, and using these materials to try to prefabricate in a warehouse, to pre-formulate a project in a warehouse. You can see our recent graduates, now construction workers, prefabricating this building in a warehouse, coordinating all of the individual pieces, figuring out how to pack and ship them, practicing the construction of the prefabricated building outside of the warehouse where they're doing the prefabrication. Then they had to put the entire building on a barge and drag it over to this island, and then build a foundation and assemble this building on site. And so what you're seeing here, even in a school, even in a place like Yale, which is primarily an institution focused on training the next generation of top designers, a complete refocus on the end-to-end relationships between what happens as a decision maker, as a designer, and what the implications are of that decision all the way out to the end of the supply chain. And so the question is, what does this really mean? And could technology accelerate that? And so one way to look at this is to say, well, there is a logical progression of technologies that have been used in the building industry, starting with thousands of years of drawing, and then a couple of decades drawing in CAD, and then the break to building information modeling. And then we add on this idea of cloud and the internet and the digitization, the intensification of digitization of the building industry, and you get some other idea about what I'm going to call integrated digital delivery, or as the building industry becomes more digitized, and as we begin as participants in that industry to look more comprehensively at the supply chain, can technology create some of those kinds of connections and really shift the perspective that we need to have on our ship to all the pieces? And when I was at Autodesk and we talked about how technology would change the building industry, we always argued that it's technology plus a couple of other extra factors. In the beginning of the BIM argument, it was the inefficiency of the building industry and razor thin margins. Now the problem has become bigger because the perspective on the kinds of challenges that the industry needs to face are also becoming bigger. And so this idea that maybe there is a virtuous relationship between the pieces of the building industry as it becomes digitized might be the technological catalyst that would move us forward in that direction. And so between Autodesk and coming back to Yale full time, I wrote this book called Architecture, Design, Data, Practice Competency in the Era of Computation. And in that book, I tried to extend some of the arguments that he made about building information modeling to suggest that if the building industry became more digitized, that there was a virtuous relationship between design data, construction data, and operations data. This is not a new argument, but the argument was building information modeling as a strategy for organizing all of the insight created during the proposition was a central location that could rationalize that set of relationships. And that sounded like it's a thesis, but it didn't actually turn out to be the case, because what's really happening is, in my opinion, is what I'm going to call representational dispersion. And representational dispersion is, in each stage of the building process, what seems to be happening is each phase creates its own digital infrastructure and replicates the siloed processes that the paper-based process used to reflect. So you have different tools in conceptual design, different tools in building during design development and construction documents, different tools used for producing shop drawings, different tools that are necessary for representing and managing construction. Central modeling representational tool like Revit or Navisworks or MicroStation or SketchUp or Trifecta or Triforma. But everybody's got their own little pile of tools, and they're largely disconnected, creating a world of lots of little BIMs. So there was this thesis that it was going to be one big global intergalactic BIM, but what with is lots of little BIMs. And now you're seeing another issue start to emerge, this thing called the digital twin. I don't even know what that is. It's some information from the Revit model, information from the Navisworks model, information coming from the owner's building control system to create something called a digital twin. But really what a digital twin is, if it were really working, is a concept that's more like Big BIM, like maybe all this stuff has a rational relationship to one another. And so technologically, where we are right now is we've got a bunch of people using modeling and drafting tools, a bunch of people using analysis and simulation engines, like to do structural engineering, to do carbon, to do cost estimating. And then you've got companies like Autodesk and others, Procore, making denominational tools that create the common denominator, that move everybody's completely disorganized information around. So at least you can find it, even if you can't use it. And it certainly doesn't have necessarily a relationship. In fact, what I would argue is, despite all the energy and time invested to the contrary, the building information modeling transition in the building industry, which had the promise of the image on the left, everything modeled in high detail, in 3 dimensions, perfectly understood, perfectly represented. Everybody can get to that information. It's going to be great. What it's really turned into is a better way of doing the thing on the right, which is producing a good old-fashioned working drawing. Drawing looks great, well coordinated, all the lines match, all the door numbers match, we didn't miss any section lines, all the bubbles are coordinated, but we have not leveraged that information in a way that really could have made a fundamental change in the building industry. But maybe now we're at that moment because we're at an economic existential tipping point. We've got a lot of venture capital pouring into the building industry to improve the technology. And we've also attracted the attention of the broader business community in the form of, for example, our friends from McKinsey, who've suddenly decided that construction is cool, and they're writing a lot of reports about it, including this one a couple of months ago called The Next Normal in Construction, where what they essentially assert is there are interesting things happening in construction, and we're going to tell you what they are. And if you really think about them hard, what you're going to realize is that there's industrialization happening in the building industry. In other words, prefabrication, there's digitization, but their future industry dynamic that they identify that's most interesting is value chain control and integration with the supply chain. So this theme that I kind of identified that's related to some of these broader challenges might be catalyzed by technology in a way that changes the nature of the industry. And so what our friends from McKinsey would say here is, these are their diagrams that are versions of diagrams that we've all seen a million times before, those of us who've been in the industry. The industry is disaggregated, that's the diagram on the top. And if we just use manufacturing techniques, the industry will become aggregated and integrated and consolidated and efficient and blah, 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 blah. So we'll stipulate that that's an interesting vision from McKinsey that's very optimistic, but the coefficients of friction are very high. However, there are beginning to be indications out there that some of this kind of supply chain integration is starting to happen. There are examples like Mace Construction in the UK, who has this thing called the factory floor, which is essentially they build a factory, an enclosed on the job site, and slip form the entire building as a factory sliding up the building. So they're bringing manufacturing capabilities to the site. We all know lots of examples of, the Kateras and others of the world. In fact, my colleague, Renee Chang, who's the dean of the School of the Built College of the Built Environment at the University of Washington, and I are doing a research project right now where we're trying to look at, not from the top down, not from a theoretical perspective, but from the bottom up, what are examples of players in the building industry who are beginning to verticalize by combining one or more aspects of the supply chain in their value propositions. So they integrate suppliers with manufacturing, designers who collaborate or instantiate construction activity in their business models, different kinds of relationships. And we very quickly came up with a list of about 60 different companies that are doing some form of this. And we started charting them on this chart that you see here on the right, looking at what they do internally, resources they depend on, who they work with externally for intellectual resources, what their relationship is with regulatory officials, and then how they deliver their products to their suppliers. And so thematically, what's happening here is the structure of the supply chain is starting to change. Things are starting to kind of grow together. Technology might provide a backbone for that. And we can begin exploring a whole bunch of these questions like the ones that I introduced earlier. So whether it's Professor Organsky's work on the circular carbon economy, where he suggests that buildings can harvest the carbon that the cities that they're in create, and that carbon that comes from that city is then is stored essentially in wood products, which then become part of construction. So you have a virtuous circular economy. Or for example, our slavery course, where I'm trying to explain to my students that as an architect, you are 10 or 12 supply chain tiers away from an enslaved charcoal worker in the forest of Brazil who harvests wood from a tree farm that forms the charcoal, that smelts the pig iron, that goes to the steel supplier, that eventually goes to the fabricator, that goes to the erector, and that you actually, some part of your building has slave labor in it, even though you're 10 steps away from the process. And if we're going to attack problems like this, whether it's embodied carbon or embodied slave labor, we've got to have a different view of the supply chain, and maybe technology is a way of doing that. And so what our friends from McKinsey are suggesting is, one of the ways to do that is to integrate the supply chain and create lots of information flows and begin using manufacturing techniques in order to make that happen. I think that may be too simple an answer, because it doesn't address the problem of how to disintermediate, to use their term, the lack of relationship between the various players in the process. And there are likely two more technologies that might help us do that. And those are generative design and scripting. In other words, the use of algorithms to manipulate data, and machine learning and artificial intelligence, where computers learn how to create the relationship between pieces of information by studying vast amounts of information. What we have in AEC now is an emergent condition where BIM simulation and data management tools have created increasingly large piles of digital information with no relationship to one another. And so maybe the idea going forward is that we can understand the supply chain, we can understand the relationship between all of these processes, we can create this idea of a digital twin that I'm going to call an integrated digital twin, by layering on these additional technologies that create the relationship between the pieces. Because if we wait for the building industry to create its own intergalactic theory of interoperability, that will never happen. There are almost, no financial incentives for doing that when there are makers in the marketplace like the Kateras and the AECOMs of the world that might choose to work on that, but they can't attack the disaggregation of the industry. And one of the reasons they can't do that, and these are the kinds of things that come out of those technologies, but one of the reasons that they can't attack that problem is we need external investment in the AEC industry, because there's not enough internal resources to figure this stuff out on our own. And so if you look at some of the statistics that have come from our colleagues at Zweig in terms of their what they see about growth patterns in the AEC industry, the vast majority of our our colleagues in the U.S. industry are not in super fast growth mode, and therefore they're not generating super large margins. And the at least 40% of them, at least according to Zweig, are only making average profits. And so average profits in the AEC industry are 1/5 of what average profits are in the technology industry. And so there's a tremendous amount of margin pressure on the players in the industry, which creates a disincentive for innovation and trying new kinds of stuff. So the ideas for new kinds of stuff largely have to come from the outside, from other sources in the supply chain, which is why it's so important to have a broader view. And then the other context, of course, which we have to look at is the current economic circumstances. I mean, I track very carefully the AIE's Architectural Billings Index because it correlates pretty strongly to the construction economy and frankly, my students' possibilities for getting jobs. And the ABI, you can see a very strong correlation between global economic conditions and how the Architectural Billings Index actually works. And so those of you who've been around for a while, like me, every 6, 7, 8 years you get a recession. This one took a little bit longer, right? This one took 11 years, and then it really hit us hard. But I'll tell you, I've been keeping this graph for a long time, and in March of 2020, I had to change the scale on the graph because the Architectural Billings Index, which works on a scale of 1 to 50, where anything above 50 means growth and anything below 50 means contraction, went down to 28. So it was pretty scary. Here's a zoom in. The blue line is the ABI, the green line is inquiries, and the orange line is contract signed. So we're climbing out, but it's been 6 or 7 months. We're still in negative territory, which means on the architecture side, things are beginning to contract. And so the problem is, of course, that our industry has this bizarre bilateral strategy where when things are going really great, we don't invest because we're putting money away for a rainy day. And then when things get bad, we don't invest because we're spending the money we put away for a rainy day. And so the question that I'd like to introduce for some thought is this the moment where, if we take the perspective of the broadest set of issues that are germane to this building industry, our ability to deploy certain kinds of technology, to understand the relationship between all of those players, and that this existential moment that we're in and after the pandemic, is this the time when we can really begin to attack these problems? And I want to argue that perspective from the structure of the argument that I made in my book, which was essentially that there are 3 questions that we have to ask ourselves in the building industry if we are going to address these bigger questions of improving it. And those 3 questions have to do with agency. What is the relationship between the players in the process? Who's doing what to whom, in other words? Methodologies. How do we exchange information? How do we collaborate? How do we use technology? How do we improve the processes that aggregate to deliver a building? And then ultimately the value proposition. Can we get out of a realm where the entire building industry is predicated on a heavily commoditized strategy of exchanging value for lowest first cost? And we need some strategies for doing that. But in order to do so, we actually have to change the approach to converting value across the supply chain. And that change in approach is about shifting our value proposition away from commodification and toward what I like to call outcomes or making things happen. That, our clients do not build buildings in order to meet budgets and schedules, or to reduce change orders, or to do any of the kinds of things that are so close to the hearts of those of us who drive the process of the AEC industry. What our clients actually build buildings for, or build stuff to do, is to achieve some aspiration. And that our commoditized the commoditized delivery models that we use that are completely disaggregated and are not related to a broader view of the supply chain are transactional and commoditized because we fail to correlate our work with these higher order aspirations that our clients have. And what I wrote about in my book is that I think there's a hierarchy of these kinds of outcomes that our clients are looking for. And there's a strategy that we might be able to use to get to them. And so I graph for my students this thesis that says it's a two-axis problem. On the y-axis are the various players who participate in a project. And on the x-axis are increasingly valuable things that can be done to make projects better for clients. And that the left-hand side of that chart, which are what I call transactional and executional performance, drive value in a relatively slow way because they're already expected by our clients. But operational and aspirational performance actually drive value in a very rapid way because they're much more strongly correlated to the things our clients want to do. So down here on the transactional side, if you're an architect or an engineer, you can do your job better, right? But you're negotiating with yourself. You're working by yourself. You're conforming to the brief. You're meeting the schedule for your deliverables. You're hitting degrees of design quality. You're designing something that meets cost, but you're working pretty much by yourself to accomplish the goals that are sub-optimized inside your particular delivery silo. If you involve your collaborators who are builders, you can get to some bigger issues that clients clearly care about, but you're still doing the things that our clients kind of expect us to do when we come to the table in the first place. So you're meeting budgets, you're meeting schedules, the building's getting built at the level of quality that you thought, your systems are operating to spec, they're durable, they're fine, but no client hires a C team to deliver a project and doesn't expect this stuff to happen. They just get disappointed when we're unable to do it. But once we begin looking at the supply chain, including our clients in a more broad way, and ask our clients to set expectations about how a building, for example, might operate around its systems or its energy or its embodied carbon, or how well its staff are able to use it, or how easy it is to maintain. Now we've taken a broader view of the problem. We're looking across the entire delivery proposition and saying to a client, we're not just going to deliver this thing to you, we're going to deliver this thing that does stuff better for you, but we would like to be rewarded if that happens. We don't want you to just put a quarter in the slot and get a building. And what you really wanted to spend 20 cents, but it's going to cost you 25 cents. How about paying us 20 cents, but if the building does really, really well, paying us 50 cents? And if we can build that kind of capability, over time, we can get to this kind of nirvana, which is where we say to our clients, we know you're building this building because you want to economically perform, you want to make your employees happier, you want to do a better job educating people, you want to have healthier patients. We can make projects that make that happen if we work together and we deploy technologies that create these digital twins that allow us to predict and analyze and speculate about potential outcomes, and then correlate our value proposition to those outcomes. And so part of that argument is to say, well, the traditional process of concept to design to production to bid to build is an exercise in the increasing reliability of information, which is the dark line here, but discontinuities in the handoffs. In other words, as we hand off traditional deliverables between phases, we actually degrade the quality of that information, but there are actually a series of opportunities that we could apply that would increase the quality of that information as it goes through the supply chain. And as a consequence, it gives us an opportunity as AEC professionals to start thinking about buildings as relationships of systems. This is a different perspective than thinking about a building or a built project as a supply chain problem, that there are a whole series of systems, economic, energy, I just picked some randomly when I did this diagram, that suggests that a construction project has to be looked at in a series of frames of references. The supply chain is one of those series of frames of references, and that we need to look at the relationship between those frames and the degrees of resolution and scale to really understand when we make the decision about how to build a building, the choice we make about a window affects the overall planet, it affects the region, it affects the neighborhood, and it clearly affects the building. If we can begin to consolidate our representations and our digital tools, but we choose to look at the problem in a more comprehensive way, we can change the value proposition of the building. So my argument essentially is the following. Right now, what we have is a world where the agency of designers and builders is this weird combination of professional standards of care on the design side and product standards making things on the construction side. And the way we deliver those projects is by iterating during design. In other words, trying out lots of alternatives until we find one that we think that works, using our intuition and our judgment to pick one, and then delivering those projects through fixed deliverables like a fixed price construction contract. And the value proposition is pretty straightforward. We compete based on price, and whoever has the lowest first cost wins. And that if we're able to look more comprehensively by taking advantage of this pandemic moment to re-examine our processes, there's a different future state that's possible out there. That the relationship between design intent and construction execution could be combined in a strategy around the control of information and the integration of information across the supply chain. And we could use tools and these digital tools and analytical tools and machine learning tools and building information modeling tools to be much more systematic about how we explore problems, how we predict outcomes, what we think is going to happen, and draw analytical conclusions that are correlated to those higher level aspirations that our clients have, and that ultimately the value proposition of the building industry becomes one of outcomes instead of commoditized first cost. And so ultimately around this question of pedagogy, practice, and the profession, to me, the big themes have to do with the following. Number one, can we redefine the objectives of the supply chain? Can we redefine the overall objectives by looking at the supply and its relationship and the information flows and our obligations and our value propositions in a different kind of way? Can we use technology as a tool that combines those things? Can we take that technology to rely on the skills that we're learning during the pandemic around digitalization, the exchange of information, representation, analysis? In other words, we're all our cases almost entirely virtually now. Instead of looking at that as a disadvantage, is it ultimately an advantage? And then ultimately that might result in a stronger integration between the components of the supply chain. At the top line, design, construction, and operation. At the bottom line, all the way down to that carbon that's generated, to that worker who needs to be taken care of, to making a series of responsible decisions. Then that what we would want to move toward is a series of delivery models that are much more strongly predicated on outcomes and much less strongly correlated on commoditized exchanges of value. And so with that, I don't see any questions, but I'm happy to take some questions if there are any. How'd I do here, Chad? Like 50 minutes? I think that's where I am. So are you guys probably think I'm smoking weed here, right? Are there questions? Okay. All right. So Katie's question on the current state is extremely compelling. Who should lead the charge? Oh, that's such a great question. It takes a team, etc. That is a really, really great question. So when we first started the BIM initiative at Autodesk, I watched the entire discussion, and I was part of the groups that were, driving the technology change, working on BIM standards, talking about IPD. Early parts of the problem, it was a power struggle. It's like, okay, let's see. The architects were thinking, okay, we can use BIM to weaponize our power and control over the construction industry. And my contractor customers were saying, well, we're finally going to have something to beat these architects and engineers into submission. And the owners were saying, well, maybe if we force these people to use BIM, we'll have less change orders. It was all an exercise in power and control. But the reality ultimately is there is no one who has power and control in this construct. The people who have the most leverage are the clients. And so until clients begin demanding a different set of results, I don't think things are going to move in a way that's as fast as possible. And this issue is top of mind for me right now because Lou and I are teaching the seminar on forced labor, and it's exactly the same question around a different set of issues. An architect, an engineer, a contractor, we have no idea who that worker is all the way at the end of the line, who is, that 9-year-old girl in India who's crushing gravel that's going to end up in my foundations, or that guy who's harvesting wood enslaved in Brazil that's eventually going to become my I-beam. Until clients begin to reach levels of consciousness about these kinds of issues, whether it's how inefficient their projects are or what other kinds of problems their project, the industry will not move. So there's going to have to be some consciousness raising, I think. There's a question here about the landscape architecture field. I think you're right. I think the supply chain is shorter in landscape architecture, and it may be easier to accomplish this if you can find clients and participants who are interested in the problem, because I think there's a broader control of the supply chain. There's examples we've been using in class this semester in the slavery class is a company in Great Britain that provides landscape materials like pavers and other stuff. And they market directly to their customers that they are a slave-free supplier, that they check their supply chains all the way down to the end to make sure that there's no forced labor in their supply chain. So it might work, right? Okay, so Bethany Hahn is asking about how you find partners with this philosophy when the pressure is time. And so I think that question could be asked when the pressure is whatever you want, time, margin, right? Professional liability. And I don't know exactly what the answer to that question is, except for I will say that the landscape of potential collaborators is much broader than it used to be. And so you don't really need to meet a potential collaborator, at a industry luncheon. You can find people, frankly, that you can work with virtually all across the world. And so it may be that we need to, in order to find collaborators who are sympathetic to this kind of an idea, the first step is to take a play from our millennial generation and start trying to create a virtual rather than a physical network of industry participants who want to drive this kind of change and look for opportunities to work on those things. Because I do think the competitive landscape and the talent network is going to be completely reformulated by the pandemic. Okay, question from Ace LC about AI. Fast forward into a future where machine learning has surpassed the architect's ability to manipulate design possibilities, even with tools like Dynamo, less blah, 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 blah. How valuable? Okay, great question. How valuable is the architect to the owner in 3020? I'm going to slightly rephrase your question and change the date to 2030, because I think that's actually closer to the question. But I actually started, my current research is on this question. And the real issue here is what is automatable and what is the value proposition of what designers actually do? And so what's happening in the world of AI right now, and I think if you're really interested in this topic, you should read the work of Daniel Susskind. Susskind is an economist at Oxford who writes a lot about the effect of artificial intelligence on the world of work. His first book, which he wrote with his dad, is called The Future of the Professions. And if you're really interested in this topic, you should read that, where he essentially argues that the basic fundamental principles of professionalism, which is expertise and hoarding access to knowledge, are destroyed by artificial intelligence, and that the nature of professions is going to change. And then in Daniel Susskind's second book called The Future of Work, no, I'm sorry, it's called A World Without Work. He argues that people are looking at this problem incorrectly, that artificial intelligence is not going to replace jobs like architects. Artificial intelligence is focused on tasks. And that if you look at this through the lens of jobs, it's too crude. It's too crude, that it's actually tasks. So if you accept that thesis, what tasks might be taken over by artificial intelligence in the future? Well, it turns out that things is a pretty big problem. That designing, it requires a lot of ambiguous, subjective thinking. But there's a whole bunch of stuff that we do as architects, engineers, and builders that's a little less subjective. It's procedural. It has to do with using lots of examples. It's based on formulas. Like as a young architect, the time I spent doing things like checking to make sure the door schedule was correct, looking to see if my exit stair was wide enough, checking to make sure all my stair treads were equal, all this kind of banal routine stuff. All of that stuff is absolutely going to get done by artificial intelligence, in my opinion. The question is, what do the design professions do with the extra space? And there are two strategies. Strategy one is what we've always done, lower fees and give away the time to our clients who are going to realize that some of our work is automated. The other strategy is to say, okay, I don't have to spend time doing this transactional analytical stuff anymore because it's largely being automated. I can provide more value to my clients. And so there has to be a strategy for providing more value. The move toward artificial intelligence, in my opinion, unless there's some large scale social changes, is kind of inexorable. We as designers and builders have to create a strategy for how we're going to leverage that stuff to improve our product. Otherwise, it's entirely possible that there will be a large number of projects where, particularly from large clients like, the Home Depots, the Starbucks, the Whole Foods of the world, where they're just going to automate the entire design process. And I think that would be a real shame. So let's see, Olivia, Chad, how much time do we have left? Like 1 minute.
Well, that actually we are at the end of our time. You've
Okay.
also answered all the questions. So Phil, thanks again so much for your time. I know I got a lot out of your talk, and so did others. So appreciate your time.
Yeah,
Up next
feel free to reach out.
is.
Thank you.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, absolutely. And if you joined late or you want to share Phil's talk with others, we did record it, and that recording will be available shortly. I just want to point everybody's attention to what's up next. It's our Elevate Her Symposium. You'll need to get out of this Zoom and join the next one, but we've got another Elevate Her cohort presentation that's starting right now. So hope to see you on the other side. Phil, thanks again for your time. I really appreciate the work you're doing and sharing it with our audience.